Frank Zane spoke little about Mike Mentzer for most of his public life. The three-time Mr. Olympia, among the most educated and methodical champions the sport has produced, kept his views largely private. At 83, he is now speaking directly about Mensah, about the 1979 Olympia, about the events of 1980, and about the broader arc of a sport that defined both their lives. Mike Mentzer was a gifted athlete whose later years were marked by deepening bitterness. Zayn observed that deterioration closely over many years from a position few others shared. To place any of this in context, it helps to return to the late 1970s. Bodybuilding had just emerged from Arnold Schwarzenegger's dominant run. 6 Mr. Olympia titles, the Pumping Iron documentary, widespread magazine coverage, and wider contracts that helped bring the sport into mainstream visibility. Schwarzenegger stepped away from competition in 1975, leaving a gap that the sport had not yet found a clear answer to. Two men moved into that space, and they represented almost entirely different ideas about what the sport could be. Frank Zane was born in Kingston, Pennsylvania in 1942. Before becoming a professional bodybuilder, he worked as a math and chemistry teacher. He earned a bachelor's degree in education, a second in psychology, and eventually a master's degree in experimental psychology from Cal State. The nickname the Chemist referred as much to his systematic academic approach to preparation as to his physique. His diet, posing, and recovery were managed with the same precision he brought to the classroom. Zane competed at around 185 to 195 pounds at 5'9", which was lean by any measure in the sport. His waist measured approximately 29 inches, among the smallest recorded on a Mr. Olympia competitor. His shoulder-to-waist ratio and his vacuum pose were the products of sustained, deliberate refinement. Mike Mentzer was born in Philadelphia in 1951. He began training with weights at 11 years old, drawn to the sport after seeing bodybuilders on magazine covers. By 15, he could bench press 370 pounds at a body weight of 165 pounds. He had the intellectual inclination of a philosophy student and the physical presence to match his ambitions, and he was convinced with complete certainty that he understood the mechanics of the human body better than anyone else in the sport. His training philosophy, which he called heavy duty, drew on the ideas of Nautilus machine inventor Arthur Jones. The approach was unconventional: train less, train harder, and stop. One set taken to absolute failure. No extended sessions. No high volume work. One demanding set per exercise, followed by full rest and recovery. At a time when most bodybuilders were training twice a day, 6 days a week, Mensah was arguing that all of it was not just unnecessary, it was actively counterproductive. These were two men who embodied two fundamentally different philosophies, not just about bodybuilding but about the sport's underlying logic. Zayn was meticulous, patient, quietly confident, and deeply internal. Mensah was forceful, philosophical, publicly certain, and moving toward a confrontation that would define and ultimately end the final years of his competitive career. By 1979, the two were on a direct collision course. The contest they were about to enter would become one of the most debated nights in the history of the sport. October 6, 1979, Veterans Memorial Auditorium, Columbus, Ohio. The Mr. Olympia lineup that year was the largest in the contest's history to that point. 15 competitors, including some of the most celebrated bodybuilders of the era: Chris Dickerson, Robbie Robinson, Danny Padilla, Tom Platz, Boyer Coe, Albert Beckles, Roy Callender. By any measure, it was a formidable field. But the central question of the evening was understood by everyone in the building. It came down to two men, the reigning champion Frank Zane and Mike Mentzer. Mentzer arrived at that Olympia at 5 feet 8 inches and 220 pounds. What he had built was, by any honest assessment, extraordinary. His proportions were remarkable: massive arms, a thick chest, exceptional development across every muscle group. And he carried that mass with a degree of definition that most athletes at that weight could not achieve. Head judge Jim Mannion, who would later become president of the IFBB Pro League, watched Mentzer's performance and said something that would be repeated for the next 4 decades. "If Mensah doesn't win, it's a crime." The legendary Serge Nubret put the contradiction of the evening more simply: Mike is better, but Zayn is the champion. Frank Zane that night weighed under 200 pounds. He was, as he would later write on his own website, in the best shape of his life, relaxed, confident, and certain that he had won. He and his wife Christine went to dinner. He had a steak, a baked potato, and described feeling a deep inner calm. By the time the evening show and the pose down took place, observers noted that Mensah had come in slightly smoother, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but enough. The conditioning edge that might have decided the overall in his favor had softened. Zayn won his 3rd consecutive Mr. Olympia title. Mensah won the heavyweight division but finished 2nd in the overall. What followed the results said a great deal about how each man processed the outcome. Frank Zane went to the victory banquet, drank wine, and celebrated with Christine. At some point during the evening, Mike Mentzer approached their table. He looked at Zayn and said, "It's not your fault that you won." Zayn later wrote that he took it as a compliment. He thought about retiring. He wondered whether it could get any better than this. Mensah's reaction was measured in public. He told Zayn directly that he deserved the win, but privately the result had unsettled him in a significant way. He was the most discussed bodybuilder in the sport at that moment. He had won his weight class with a perfect score. The head judge had told him the outcome was effectively unjust, and still he had lost to a competitor 30 pounds lighter than him, in a sport that was supposed to reward the superior physique. He began asking questions about how the judging worked, and why the outcome had gone the way it did. Those questions would define the remainder of his career, cost him nearly everything he had built, and according to people close to him, may have contributed to his death. 1 year later, the sport produced a result so far outside any reasonable boundary that the 1979 contest came to look, by comparison, like a minor procedural dispute. On October 4th, 1980, the Mr. Olympia was held at the Sydney Opera House, a venue built for cultural performance, and an unlikely setting for what became the most disputed competition in the sport's history. The controversy it generated has not fully subsided in the 4 decades since. Going into 1980, Frank Zane held the title as 3-time defending champion. During his preparation, he suffered a serious injury at his Palm Springs home. He slipped near his pool, fell, and cut his urethra. He was hospitalized, lost approximately 15 pounds of muscle during his recovery, and was uncertain whether he would compete. He consulted Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had retired from competition and was regarded as an elder figure in the sport. Schwarzenegger told him to go to Sydney, that he could do it and would be fine. What Zayn did not know was that Schwarzenegger intended to compete himself. The announcement came 1 day before the contest. Arnold Schwarzenegger, 5 years out of competition, a 6-time Mr. Olympia champion, with the film Conan the Barbarian approaching and a professional need to appear muscular on screen, had entered the 1980 Mr. Olympia. By his own account, he had been preparing for approximately 8 weeks. The response from other competitors ranged from disbelief to open anger. Zayn, upon understanding what was happening, approached Schwarzenegger about sharing a dressing room. Schwarzenegger agreed and mentioned they were filming a comeback documentary, suggesting Zayn appear in it. Zayn declined, located a private room, and focused on his own preparation. That morning, before any competitor took the stage, a dispute broke out during the official competitors' meeting. All 15 of the original entrants had signed a petition to eliminate the 2-weight class system and move to a single open class. Schwarzenegger, who had entered late and was physically larger than most of the field, supported keeping the 2-class format. The discussion became contentious. According to multiple witnesses, including Tom Platz, who was present, Schwarzenegger at some point directed a comment at Mensah about his midsection, suggesting that Mensah's waist had cost him the previous year's title and would do so again. Frank Zane later described the scene in an account published on his website, the meeting extending well past its expected duration, the argument between Schwarzenegger and Mensah escalating, and then Mensah moving towards Schwarzenegger physically. Officials including Bill Pearl intervened before the situation worsened. The confrontation was stopped. Whatever its precise character, the effect on Mensah was clear. He left the meeting with his preparation disrupted and his focus gone. The contest that followed has been debated ever since. Schwarzenegger came to the stage in condition that most observers present described as well below his competitive peak. Boyako later said the winner had legs that belonged in a chicken nest. Several competitors and witnesses said they would have placed Schwarzenegger no higher than 5th. The judging panel, however, included a number of people with personal ties to him. Reg Park, his longtime mentor and idol, was a judge. Albert Busek, a German acquaintance, was a judge. Kawashima, a friend from Hawaii who had arranged guest posing appearances for Schwarzenegger on the islands, was also a judge. All 3 scored Schwarzenegger at the top of the first round. A veteran judge named Peter McCarthy, considered less likely to favor Schwarzenegger, was removed from the panel under circumstances the sport's historical record describes as unusual, and replaced by someone understood to be another of Schwarzenegger's associates. Schwarzenegger won. Chris Dickerson finished 2nd, and was heard expressing disbelief as he left the stage. Frank Zane placed 3rd. Boyako was 4th. Mike Mentzer, who had tied Ko on points, was awarded 5th. The audience booed, not politely, loudly, from the balconies down through the floor. The Sydney Opera House filled with the sound of thousands of people who sensed, even without knowing every behind-the-scenes detail, that something had gone seriously wrong. CBS Sports had traveled to Australia to film the contest for broadcast. After witnessing what happened, they returned to the United States and declined to air it. It was the last time an American broadcast television network would film the Mr. Olympia. Frank Zane picked up his trophy backstage and it slipped from his hand. He would later clarify that the oil from his competition prep had transferred to the trophy, causing it to fall, not that he threw it. That clarification matters to Zayn, and it says something about the man. He is careful about what is true. He cares about accuracy. The others from that night were, for the most part, too angry to concern themselves with the details. Mensah announced his retirement immediately. He was 29 years old. The years following 1980 were, for Mike Mentzer, a period of compounding losses that no amount of intellectual force could reverse. To understand what Frank Zane would eventually say about all of it, it helps to first understand how far Mensah fell. Before 1980, Mensah had been earning roughly $200,000 a year from seminars, magazine columns, courses, and training booklets. His heavy-duty system was selling. His name was prominent throughout the bodybuilding world. His column in Joe Weider's magazines reached millions of readers. He had built a recognizable brand. After 1980, after he retired, after he publicly characterized the contest as fraudulent, after he positioned himself in opposition to the Weider establishment, the income disappeared. Not gradually. Immediately. The seminars ended. The magazine column was gone. His blacklisted status within the IFBB meant that every professional door the sport had opened to him was now closed. He took a position with Arthur Jones at Nautilus for a period, working on training research. He and his brother Ray relocated to DeLand, Florida. That arrangement eventually ended as well. Ray was let go by Jones for what was described as insubordination. Mike, loyal to his brother, left shortly after. The losses then became personal. His parents died. His mother's death hit him particularly hard. He later described receiving a phone call from a doctor at 5 in the morning, then driving around for hours. His 10-year relationship with his fiancée Kathy Gelfo ended. The magazine he had been editing, Workout Magazine, ceased publication. He returned to the bodybuilding world in the late 1980s, writing for Ironman magazine and slowly rebuilding his standing as a trainer and theorist. In the early 1990s, he introduced a young Dorian Yates to high-intensity training principles. Yates went on to win 6 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles and publicly credited Mentzer's methods for his success. For a time, it appeared to be a form of vindication, evidence that Mentzer's ideas would outlast the system that had marginalized him. But the physical consequences of his competitive years were accumulating. The intensive drug use during his career, the blood clotting disorder he shared with his brother Ray, the cardiovascular strain that professional bodybuilding of that era routinely imposed on its athletes. All of it had taken a toll. By the late 1990s, Mensah was living in a small apartment in Rolling Hills Estates, Los Angeles, training clients by phone and working on philosophical writings that drew on Ayn Rand's objectivism alongside his training principles. It was a small, contained existence, a long way from the stage of the Sydney Opera House. Tom Platz, who had been present during the confrontation between Mensah and Arnold in 1980, later said at a seminar in Zurich that he believed the bitterness Mensah carried from that night functioned like a disease, that it consumed him from within, that it was among the reasons Mensah died so young. Frank Zane, during those same years, constructed a markedly different kind of life. While Mensah moved toward isolation, Zayn did something uncommon in competitive bodybuilding. He planned for what came after. He built something capable of sustaining him once the competing was finished, methodically in the same manner he had developed his physique, with patience, discipline, and a long-term orientation that the sport's internal politics could not undermine. After his competitive career concluded, his final Olympia appearance was in 1983. Zayn moved to Palm Springs and opened Zayn Haven, a facility offering individual sessions and coaching programs built around his approach to aesthetics, symmetry, and what he described as the mind-body connection. He and his wife Christine operated it together. It was intimate, selective, and entirely independent of the wider apparatus. No sponsorships, no organizational obligations, no outside interests to accommodate. He continued writing. He had already published The Zayn Way to a Beautiful Body in 1979. He followed it with Super Bodies in 12 weeks, Zayn Nutrition, Frank Zane Mind Body Spirit, The High Def Handbook, and The Mind in Bodybuilding, among others. The work moved beyond exercise programming into questions of psychology, how the mind shapes the body, how athletes can sustain not only their physical condition but their mental and emotional health across a lifetime of training. He earned a master's degree in experimental psychology in 1990. He taught, he coached, he eventually relocated to San Diego. He continued training not competitively but as a personal discipline, a consistent part of how he lived. Well into his 70s and now into his 80s, Frank Zane remains one of the most articulate and engaged figures in the sport's history. His website is active. He continues to post and to coach through his Zayn Experience program. Through all of those years, he largely left the rivalry with Mensah where it had ended. In Columbus, Ohio in 1979, in Sydney, Australia in 1980. He did not relitigate it publicly. He made no statements about what the outcome should have been, who deserved what, or where the judging had gone wrong. He moved forward, or at least that was how it appeared. Frank Zane did not speak often or publicly about Mike Mentzer, but when he did, in entries on his own website, in interviews given later in his career, what emerged was the account of a man who had thought carefully about those years for a long time. His account of the pre-contest meeting in Sydney in 1980 is among the most detailed on record. Zane describes the meeting with a specificity that most athletes of his generation do not bother with. He describes watching Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mensah argue. He describes Mensah making a derogatory remark toward Arnold, and Arnold responding with a comment about Mensah's midsection and then Mensah lunging. He describes Bill Pearl and other officials intervening. A room full of elite athletes on the morning of the most important competition of their lives, watching two of the sport's dominant personalities nearly come to blows. What Zayn writes about those events is measured and direct. He states that in his view, Arnold did not deserve to win in 1980. He states that Colombo did not deserve to win in 1981. He also acknowledges that he himself was not at his best, that a pool accident had cost him 15 pounds of muscle, that he came in smaller than his 1979 championship form, and that he was not certain he deserved to win either. That willingness to apply the same standard to himself as to everyone else distinguishes Zayn's account from most others on the subject. On Mensah as a competitor, Zayn's assessment is equally direct. Mensah was exceptional. His size, development, and conditioning in his best moments were extraordinary. The Preju judging scores at the 1979 Olympia reflected that Mensah dominated his weight class, and the question of whether the overall title should have gone to the lighter, more aesthetically refined Zayn was a genuine debate with no clear resolution. Zayn has never suggested otherwise. Where the two men diverged was in their underlying philosophy. Zayn has written extensively about his belief that bodybuilding is an art form, that posing matters, that the total presentation of a physique, not just its mass or the conditioning of individual muscle groups, is what the sport ultimately judges. Mensah held that his physique was objectively superior, and that any judging system that failed to recognize that superiority was, by definition, corrupt. These are not simply different opinions about bodybuilding, they represent different relationships to the concept of fairness. Zayn could accept that reasonable judges might weight aesthetics over mass. Mensah could not accept that a system might reward something he considered subjective over something he considered objectively measurable. That difference in how each man processed competition, processed loss, and processed the events of 1980 goes a long way toward explaining what came after for both of them. Zayn has discussed Mensah's heavy-duty training philosophy with respect. He has acknowledged that the two men shared a commitment to training intensity, a belief that how you train matters as much as how much you train. Where they differed was in method. Zayn used volume, isolation work, and close attention to muscle contraction. Mensah used absolute intensity, minimum sets, and extended recovery. Two different answers to the same question, and both produced physiques the sport has not since replicated. At 83, Frank Zane is still training, still coaching, still writing, and still answering questions. What he says about Mike Mentzer now carries the weight of the full history. The 1979 rivalry, the 1980 Olympia, the years of watching Mensah's abilities get consumed by bitterness, and the longer view of a sport that did lasting damage to both men. He speaks about it with the composure of someone who worked through his own anger long ago, and who chose in the years that followed to keep building.